Welcome to class. I'm Trevor, and I post D&D videos every week, generally on Wednesdays. In this video, I want to give 5 tips for why you should consider running a PvP game in D&D 5th edition. Before I jump into the tips, I want to talk about why I'm making this video in the first place. On this channel, I tend to do Homebrew, and this obviously isn't that. But for New Year's Eve, which just recently passed as of recording this, my playgroup decided to do, in lieu of our normal game, a one-shot where we did a battle royale session. And it was the first time we had ever done anything like that. It went phenomenally. Like, everyone had a blast. It was more fun than I think any of us had expected. And all of the possible pitfalls that we were worried about going into it didn't even come to fruition. It was a really great break from the very serious, like, role-play heavy games that we tend to focus on. And my players loved it. And I did as well. And I was still DMing. Like, it was just an all-around great time. And I want to talk about what I did and what I would do differently in the form of a couple of tips for like running these kind of PvP sessions, it's something I'm going to do again in the future. All right. Tip number 1, be upfront. Your players need to know it's a PvP session. I would not recommend incorporating this in like a random way. I would talk about this with your players to make sure that they know this is something that is happening. I think that that's the most fun way to do it. I think you can give them the opportunity to fight each other, say like a battle pit, in a normal game, but it's just an opportunity. If you're going to force them to fight each other, as much as DMs, we can force them to do anything, I think they need to know about it in advance. This has a lot of different benefits, but it helps those players who might be in it more for the role play be aware that, like, okay, this is not that kind of game. And it helps every player, anyone, kind of think more tactically and think about what they are going to do in that particular game session. So please be upfront with your players. Make sure that everyone knows all the cards are on the table. They are going to be fighting each other. And I think that will help ensure that everyone has the right expectations. You don't want someone to bring like a charisma-heavy, kind of carousing role-play style character to a game like this because they're not going to have the opportunity to shine. Or, I mean, you're not going to want someone to bring an exploration-focused character. You want them to be combat-oriented, and the only way to do that is for them to know what they're getting into. For my second tip, I would equalize the characters. All of the characters in our PvP game were level 10, but they weren't originally. We leveled them all up to level 10. Some people made new characters from scratch. Some people leveled up existing characters. But start with level and then consider items, magic items, equipment, things like that. We had a kind of loose rule where they were allowed to bring items that they were attuned to, but nothing else. No other random items from their inventory followed them into this kind of like parallel dimension where they were fighting each other. That was an easy way to do it, but I think that there are others. And if you're just doing this as a one-off, it would also be easy to just populate characters with particular magic items that are pretty equal in power. You could even just use something like, all right, everyone can bring a rare magic item or a rare and an uncommon magic item to this fight, with DM discretion, right? And that can kind of help to equate things as well. So it's just a matter of making sure the players are all on a similar playing field will certainly help in a situation like this. For tip number 3, set the parameters. There's a lot to this, but what I mean is kind of like tip number 1, everyone should know what they're getting into. Is it team-based? Is it a fight to the death? Is it kills? How many lives are people going to get? In the game that we played, it was last man standing, but they had to actually kill each other. Like, they had to actually fight until they were at 0 HP. And I'll talk about death saves in a second. The other thing is they all brought 2 characters. So when one of their characters died, when it next came to their initiative order, they spawned in. I loved that we decided to think of this. We were worried that it was going to end too quickly, which didn't end up happening. But it allowed people to play a little bit more recklessly than they would have otherwise because they knew they had another life. If your table doesn't have additional characters created, you can just do it that way. You can just have them resurrect once per like combat. And I think that would be fine. That's a workaround that would work as well. There are a couple of other like in-game specific things that you're going to want to flesh out with your group. Are you going to use death saves? There are pros and cons to this. We didn't decide to use death saves. I understand the logic behind it though. If you want to kind of create a resource sink for some of the party members or the players, if people have to make death saves, it incentivizes people to use or waste attacks on the downed characters because they have to make those saving throws. But I could go either way on that one. The other thing to keep in mind is like normal homebrew rules for your game. Are potions an action or a bonus action? In a game like this, I would strongly encourage making potions a bonus action. especially because you control as the DM how many potions the players are going to have. And if it's an action to drink a potion, it's going to be very boring for the players who are choosing to do that. So at least in my game, for this one shot, we did potions as the bonus action, and I probably wouldn't go back, especially for in-combat one-shots. For tip number 4, there still needs to be a DM. This might sound strange, it might go without saying, but I was a little bit naive when I was planning for this originally because I thought, okay, maybe I'll be able to play. Maybe I'll be able to come up with a character and also participate. Part of the reason we'll get to in tip number 5, but all of the things that I've talked about so far, right? Tips 1 to 3 involve a DM. They involve players having someone who is not related to the events that are going on to bounce their ideas off of. And that's the importance of having a DM in a session like this. So I think that you need to have someone. It doesn't need to be the normal DM, to be clear. Like, this is a good opportunity for someone to swap out as a DM because they don't really have to run very much. But there does need to be someone who can arbitrate things like that. And I think it's very important for there to still be a DM. Tip number 5 relates to tip number 4. It is incredibly important to make the battlefield as engaging as possible. It can be a bore in combat normally when the combat is just like, I hit them back, it's frustrating. In a battle royale like this, you want to make the combat engaging. You want to hide items. Now, I wouldn't necessarily hide super complex magic items. I really just left it as potions that the players could find with the occasional pretty simple magic items that were kind of littered about. But you want them to have things to interact with. Also, you want, I don't know if you want to call them traps or layer actions, but the battlefield itself should do things. A couple of examples from my game. There were 2 towers. I kind of borrowed this from Critical Role, from one of the Critical Role battle royales. There were 2 towers, and at the tops of the towers, because I think height is also important, there were lanterns that every 3 rounds would shoot the people on the top of the towers. So this gave those characters who wanted height a place to do that, but it disincentivized to just staying on top of these towers. There were houses, buildings, that had a object in them that would create a gravity well and suck people into it. And if you were just outside of the house, it would suck you to the walls of the house. And then throughout the battlefield, there was a river of some kind, and it would overflow with water and push people around. So those things, they didn't always happen, but every so often I would be able to add in an effect like that, which again, it's another reason why having a DM is important, and it kept combat engaging. There were also some things that I didn't necessarily plan on prior to, but I decided to do, right? So without this turning into a campaign diary, some of my players decided to collaborate and they weren't actually fighting each other. So I had 2 melee combatants just kind of smashing each other. And then there were a couple of people hiding and 2 people, no joke, literally playing chess. And that it caused a slog in the combat. So what I did was I went around the table and I numbered everyone. And at initiative count 20 or whenever I decided to do it, I had them all roll. I think there were 5 players. So I had them all roll a d6. And they teleported to a number based on, right? So I just went around the table and numbered everybody, and then they rolled and they went to that number. So their character actually moved. They teleported around the map. They didn't switch places. So some people actually ended up staying where they were. But anything like this, something dynamic like this that changes things up, I think is a really interesting thing to add. And you might not need to include it, but there are certain reasons why you would want to. Also, and somebody recommended this to me on TikTok, actually, consider adding boons. If this is a battle royale that's happening with a crowd, then that could be a reason why. Or if it's happening with an individual, a god figure or something that's watching them, whatever. If there are PCs who are really slugging it out, doing really creative things, obviously you can give inspiration as a DM, but you can also do some other stuff. You can give them advantage on an attack roll, or some temporary HP, or a bonus to damage, or they can maybe find a magic item that wouldn't otherwise be there, or whatever. There are a lot of options, and I would do this with caution. You don't want to overpower or swing things too much, but I think that being able to add stuff in like that on the fly is also really useful. So just make it engaging. There's a lot of pressure on the players because they're all fighting each other, and it's just like normal party politics, right? In any kind of multiplayer situation, you don't want to make an enemy. So there's a lot of politicking that takes place, And you sometimes, as the DM, need to incite chaos to get the ball rolling. At least for my players, I did. It might not be the case for every table. And having these options and elements, I think, would be really useful for doing that. All right, bonus tip number 6, include a prep round. I stole this from Matt Mercer in one of the Critical Role Battle Royales, but if the PCs all show up in the same area, or the same general area on the battle map, and there is no non-aggressive prep round, then everyone's going to get attacks of opportunity. It's going to get really, really complicated, and it works a lot better if everyone's first round of combat is like movement, action, bonus action, but the action cannot be harmful. It can't hurt anyone. And that allows spellcasters to like get on, like activate mage armor or whatever, right? It allows rogues to hide. It lets people get away from one another and kind of get situated. And it starts that tactical thinking process. Now, you could tell players in advance that you're going to do this. And then if they know that they're going to be fighting each other and they know that they're going to have a prep round, they can plan their first round of combat prior to the game actually starting, which can get that ball rolling. So I think it's really important to like offer that as an option. Now, your players might not want to do it that way, and it's so freeform. You can just talk to the table and see what they would like. But I really think it's beneficial to have that initial, like that first round of combat not be an aggressive round of combat and let people kind of get where they want to go and set up what they want to do. Because then the second round of combat is so much more engaging because everyone feels more prepared and more ready. So that's my reasons why and my tips for running a PvP game in D&D 5e. I really think it's a great break from some of the heavier exploration and roleplay elements. And for my table, it was a really fun time. Like, that's the best way that I can describe it. If you've ever played as a player in a PvP game, let me know how it went in the comments down below. If you've ever DM'd, I'd love to hear about that too. This is obviously a very specific way to play, but for a break, I think it's a great way to kind of, I don't know, spice things up. Like, it takes the pressure off and it lets the players see different like possibilities for their character. And I think that that's cool as well. My players tend to play pretty close to the chest because they don't want their characters to die. And I understand that. But when they know that there's no stakes or the stakes are different, they can be more risky. They can do things that they wouldn't otherwise, which then could inspire them in future normal game sessions. So I really loved it. My players had a great time with it, and I'd love to hear your stories as well. If you like this kind of D&D stuff, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world. And if you have any like requests or suggestions for any kind of tips or homebrew that you'd like to see in 5e, drop those down in the comments as well. But as I always say, be safe. Make smart life choices.